So I've been thinking a little bit about rear belt skipping in the Yokomo YZ10. And I commented on this, I think, in one or two prior videos. And essentially, what happens, or what drives it, is, this is an example of a slipper assembly with a rear pulley that's a little bit worn out. Okay, as that pulley wears out, you can see the teeth are a bit worn here. You end up with a little bit more play between the pulley teeth and the rear belt, and it's just enough for that belt to start skipping. Now, on the YZ10 Works models, like the 91, the 92, the 93, this isn't too big of a deal because the rear bulkhead has slotted mounting holes to the chassis. So you can just essentially loosen up the rear bulkhead screws and then pull it back along the slotted holes to tighten up the rear belt tension, and then tighten the screws back down, and you should be okay. But on the 870C and also the 94 and the 95 YZ10 models, you don't have that luxury. You don't have an adjustable rear belt tension. So you have to devise other tricks to try to essentially either increase the rear belt tension or to just prevent the belt from skipping in the first place. And some of the things I discussed in other videos involved putting extra bearings on an extra long motor mount screw, either at the top and or bottom here on the motor mount screws, and that essentially sort of tensions the rear belt a bit so that it wraps around more of the pulley and prevents it from skipping. That does work, but that also increases bind in the drivetrain, so your motor is going to run hotter. Something else that I talked about was I found this trick from someone else that you can on the 94 and 95 YZ10s, so these models right here, you can put, let me just take this out here, you can put spacers under the rear bulkhead to try to tilt it back a bit, and supposedly that will help with the rear belt tension. I'm not entirely sure that works really well. I tried it on my 94 YZ10. This is a 95 model here. And I can't really say that I noticed too much of a difference. So one thing that I've been thinking about is there's a special Yokomo part number called ZD304S. It's essentially an aluminum motor mount that's extremely rare and extremely hard to find. But what it has is on the top cap pieces, it has a hole right about here that you would slot a screw through, and you will put bearings on either side, and that would hold down the belt for the front center belt, and would also hold down the rear center belt, and essentially keep the belt from skipping away from the pulley. Okay, so nominally it doesn't add much, if any, tension or drag to the drivetrain, but if the belt tries to skip, it literally has nowhere to go, because in order for the belt to skip, it has to kind of skip upwards off of the teeth here. But if there's a bearing holding the belt in place, the belt can't really move. So it helps to keep it from skipping. It's kind of like the roller bearings you might see in the old Kyosho laser models, internal to the gearboxes there. So it has one set of bearings up there, and then there's another set of bearings on the bottom in the actual motor mount, and then there's a little lip that they added to the front of the motor mount to put another bearing there. And you're essentially surrounding the pulley with roller bearings to keep the belt on the pulley. So what I figured I might do is to at least try to modify the cap piece with a screw hole, so that when I mount it on the motor mount, I could have, one or two bearings protruding, out into over the rear pulley to keep the belt from skipping. So that's essentially what I did right here. So basically what you do is you measure, in order to place this correctly, from the bottom surface right here. Okay, so that represents this surface here. So from that bottom surface to the top, and I forget how many millimeters it is, but you go about 1/3 of the way up from that bottom surface, and right in the center there, you drill a hole. I drilled a 2.5 millimeter hole so that I can take a 3 millimeter screw and thread it in nice and easily, and it should fit nice and snug. And to help secure it a little bit more tightly, what I did is I put a 3 millimeter nut on the other side. Now, the position of that screw hole is far enough up that the screw will run into, well, not the screw, but the nut on the other side will run into the bottom surface here of the motor mount. So what I actually had to do, let me see if I can get this in focus here. Oop. Come on. There we go. I had to grind down, part of that nut there so that it would sit flush against the bottom surface of the top portion of the motor mount. And then I could screw everything in. I could tighten this down. And excuse me. This screw is a 3x12 millimeter screw. These are 3x6 millimeter bearings that are 2.5 millimeters wide. And I just put a little washer or a 1 millimeter spacer here between the bearing and the motor mount. And you screw this in. You don't want to tighten it all the way down because then you'll bind the bearings. So you tighten it down all the way and then you back off maybe half a turn or so just to have enough space for these bearings to move around freely. And then this should, will mount. I test fitted it on this YZ10 here. So let me just pull this up. Sorry. Oops. Okay, so this will mount just like so. Okay. Oops. Onto the rear motor mount. And these bearings here won't push the belt down, but they just sit there to help guide the belt. So in case it does try to pop up, the bearings don't let it. Now, since this was all done by hand, the exact placement of this screw hole, somewhere along here was not entirely perfect. So I can't, when I eventually screw these two screws in with the top plate, so you mount the top plate, you screw these two screws in, you don't want to tighten it all the way because that'll actually press the bearings so hard against the belt that it will bind the drivetrain. So just make sure you test fit it first, and when you screw on the top deck and you finish mounting this top plate, that you don't over tighten the screws, or that you at least check the drag in the drivetrain, say with the pinion gear removed from the motor, just to make sure everything spins freely, and then you don't tighten those screws any further, just leave it there. I would think that this would work okay. One other thing I had to do, just to be clear here, is I had to shave out a bit of material on the side of the motor mount here, because these bearings are just wide enough in diameter that they would protrude into the this top little lip here on the motor mount. And you want to buy yourself as much space as possible between this outer surface here and the inside of your slipper hub, because there's only about 8 millimeters of space total there, and you have two 2.5 millimeter wide bearings, so that's 5 millimeters, plus the screw head, that's another about 1.5 millimeters, so that gets you to 6.5 millimeters, plus the 1 millimeter spacer here, so that's 7.5 millimeters, plus the sort of play, if you will, or the slack in the opening here to allow these bearings to spin freely. That gets you to about 8 millimeters. Okay, so there's a little lip here on the normal part, you can see here, that extends outwards from the top. Okay, so you want to grind that down so that it's coplanar with this bottom surface here, so that there's essentially no more lip left, and that buys you a little bit more space to fit everything in there. So you can do this and mount it, and I haven't track tested it yet, but it should work. The only thing that I'm worried about is possibly heat generation, because these bearings are going to be spinning very, very fast when this thing is running at full speed, because they will be in contact with the belt, and they might heat up. And if they get hot enough, then that heat will transfer to the plastic. The plastic may soften, and this, assembly, this screw may start to sag, or it might move around a little bit, and that may increase the bind in the drivetrain, especially along, where the bearings touch this belt here. So, I don't know, maybe it won't be a big deal. It'd be worth checking. But at the very least, if you're having problems with your rear belt skipping, you might want to try this as a potential solution. You don't necessarily have to use an original Yokomo part like what I have here. You can go to Shapeways, and there is someone who actually offers 3D printed reproduction caps just like this for your motor mount. So you can take one of those and grind it down and drill holes in that one, so that way you don't have to ruin or potentially ruin an original part. I have a few of these lying around, so I figured I'd just do it on this. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. If you really want to go nuts, you could probably also take the motor mount itself and, drill a screw hole down here if you measure it out correctly, and do the same thing. So that way you can surround the top and bottom of the pulley with roller bearings to contain the belt. But really the main problem, as far as I've found, I'm pretty sure, is the top portion of the belt. As the belt rolls around the top, that's where the skipping is going to take place first as the pulley wears down. And, you'd think to yourself, well, why don't I just buy a new pulley? Well, you can't, because these are extremely hard to find. So the more life you can squeeze out of these pulleys, the better. The longer you'll be able to run your YZ10. So, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.